I still remember the exact second my resistance failed. Not when his hand brushed mine, not when his voice dropped lower. It happened later, alone, in my bedroom, when I realized my body was reacting to the memory of him in a way it hadn't reacted to anything in years. That's when fear set in, because desire at my age isn't thrilling the way it is when you're young. It's heavier. It carries consequences. And the worst part was this. I didn't know yet that wanting him would eventually put everything I had rebuilt at risk. I used to believe that longing had an expiration date. People didn't say it out loud, but the world reminded me often enough. In the way conversations shifted, in the invisible line drawn somewhere after 50, where women were expected to want less, feel less, hope less, I told myself I was fine with that. At 58, my life was carefully arranged, stable, predictable, quiet in a way that felt earned after years of noise. I lived alone in an apartment that felt too large some nights and perfectly sufficient on others. I worked part-time, kept my routines intact, and filled the empty spaces with books, walks, and memories I had learned not to replay too often. Desire was something I remembered intellectually, like a language I once spoke fluently but no longer needed, or so I thought. What no one tells you is that desire doesn't announce its return loudly. It doesn't crash through the door. It waits. It watches you live long enough without it. And then it reappears disguised as something harmless, a conversation, a presence, a look that lingers 1 second too long. For me, it arrived on a Tuesday afternoon I almost canceled. If I'm being honest, this story isn't really about him. It's about the moment I realized I had been surviving instead of living, and how dangerous it is to wake up again once you've convinced yourself sleep was safer. By the time you reach your late 50s, you stop narrating your life in milestones. There are no more obvious before and after moments, no dramatic turning points people gather around to witness. Life becomes a collection of habits, carefully placed to keep the heart steady. Mine began every morning the same way. I woke before the alarm, lay still for a moment, and listened to the quiet. The city made soft sounds at that hour. Distant traffic, the hum of something mechanical, a neighbor's footsteps above me. I would breathe slowly, testing my body the way you test the weather through a window. Still here, still functional. Coffee came next, always the same mug. I liked it because it didn't ask for attention. I drank it standing by the window, watching strangers move through their lives with purpose I didn't envy, but respected. Once, long ago, I had moved through the world like that. I had been married for 27 years, a long marriage, the kind people admired because it endured, not necessarily because it thrived. We raised a child, built routines, learned how not to fight, which, as it turned out, wasn't the same as learning how to love deeply. When it ended, it wasn't explosive. It was quiet and mutual and devastating in a way that creeps up on you months later when no one is asking if you're okay anymore. What followed wasn't loneliness. It was absence. Desire doesn't vanish overnight. First, it stops being invited. Then it stops knocking. Finally, it settles into memory. Safe, dormant, archived. I told myself that was maturity. I dated once or twice after the divorce. Nice men, gentle men. Men who asked the right questions and touched me like they were afraid of doing something wrong. I appreciated them. I truly did. But appreciation isn't hunger. Eventually, I stopped trying to recreate something I believed belonged to another version of myself. That's the thing about aging. You don't grieve what you lose. You grieve what you stop expecting. By the time this story begins, I wasn't unhappy. I want to be clear about that. I had friends, I laughed, I was respected, I slept through the night most nights. But there was no anticipation left in my body, no feeling of leaning forward into tomorrow. And then came that Tuesday. It was raining lightly, the kind of rain that makes errands feel heavier than they need to be. I had planned to cancel my weekly visit to the Community Arts Center, a quiet class I attended mostly out of habit. I stood by the door for a long moment, coat half on, half off. Why bother? I whispered to no one. But something, curiosity, stubbornness, maybe boredom, pushed me out the door. The room was half full when I arrived. The usual faces, familiar smiles. I picked a seat near the back, set my bag down, and focused on settling into invisibility. That's when I noticed him. He wasn't new. I realized that almost immediately. He had been there before. I just hadn't registered him fully. He sat 2 rows ahead of me, slightly turned to the side, listening intently as the instructor spoke. There was nothing arresting about him at first glance, no dramatic attractiveness, no attempt to be noticed. But when he shifted in his chair and glanced back, briefly, unconsciously, our eyes met. And something in me responded before my mind could intervene. It wasn't desire, it was recognition. As if some quiet part of me whispered, "Pay attention." I looked away first, annoyed at myself for caring. The class went on. I tried to focus, but my attention drifted in small, irritating ways. Noticing how still he sat, how he leaned forward slightly when engaged, how his expressions softened when he smiled at something said nearby. When the session ended, people gathered their things slowly, stretching out conversations. I moved toward the exit, determined not to linger. "Excuse me?" His voice wasn't loud. It didn't demand space. I turned. He stood a few feet away, holding a notebook. Up close, I noticed the lines near his eyes, the kind that come from laughter lived honestly, rather than forced cheer. "You dropped this," he said, holding out a pen. I hadn't realized. "Thank you," I replied, my fingers brushing his. The contact was brief, accidental, yet my body reacted immediately, a warm awareness that surprised me with its intensity. He smiled, polite but unguarded. "I'm Daniel." I hesitated, then offered my name. And in that pause, that tiny delay before speech, something shifted. We talked for a moment. Nothing profound. Comments about the rain, about the class, about the awkward chairs. Still, when we parted, I walked home feeling oddly unsettled, not excited, uncovered. That night, as I prepared for bed, I noticed the change. My thoughts weren't racing. They weren't explicit. They weren't even focused on him precisely. They were alive. And for the first time in years, I couldn't immediately fall asleep. After that evening, I told myself not to read meaning into something so small. A pen returned, a polite smile, a conversation that lasted barely 5 minutes. People our age are supposed to be past that, past imagining stories where none exist. I reminded myself of this as the days passed, as my routines returned to their familiar shape. And yet, something had shifted. I found myself arriving at the art center a few minutes earlier than usual the following week. I noticed it without judgment, like observing someone else's behavior with mild curiosity. It doesn't mean anything, I told myself. The room filled slowly, familiar faces, familiar sounds, and then, him. Daniel arrived quietly, as before. He took a seat closer this time, just a few chairs away. He nodded at me when he noticed my gaze, a small acknowledgement that carried no expectation. Still, my pulse responded. That startled me more than anything else. Not excitement, recognition again, as if my body remembered something my mind had decided to forget. During the break, he stood beside me at the refreshment table. We didn't rush into conversation. That mattered to me. Silence between us felt comfortable. "You come here often," he said eventually, not as a question, but an observation. "Every week," I replied. "I think I'd miss it if I didn't." He smiled softly. "Me too." That was all. But from that day forward, those brief exchanges became a pattern. Never intrusive, never forced, just enough presence to become noticeable, and then impossible to ignore. We learned small things about each other naturally. That he had moved to the city after a long marriage ended quietly. that he preferred walking to driving when he could, that he liked conversations that didn't need an audience. There was no flirtation, not in the way people expect. The tension was subtler than that. It lived in pauses, in moments where we could have stepped away but chose not to. One afternoon, rain flooded the streets again. The class ended early, the instructor apologizing for a sudden power issue. People dispersed quickly, eager to get home. Daniel and I walked toward the exit at the same time. "It's coming down harder now," he noted, glancing outside. "I didn't bring an umbrella," I admitted. "I have one." He didn't immediately offer to share it. He simply stated a fact and waited. That pause mattered. It gave me space to choose. "Would you mind?" I asked. "Not at all." Under that umbrella, the world narrowed. The sound of rain grew louder, closer. We walked in sync, shoulders nearly touching. I became acutely aware of my body in a way I hadn't been in years. The warmth beneath my coat, the steady rhythm of my steps, the nearness of his presence. I didn't feel young. I felt here. At the corner where our paths separated, we stopped. "This is me," I said. "Me too," he replied, though his direction was different. We stood there longer than necessary, rain continuing its slow insistence. "I enjoy talking with you," he said carefully. I met his eyes. "I do too." That was all he needed to hear. From then on, our conversation stretched. Coffee after class, walks without destination. We spoke about past lives without bitterness, facts offered without emotional weight, histories acknowledged but not unpacked. Still, something unspoken pressed between us. It arrived first as awareness. The way his gaze held mine a second longer than politeness required. The way he listened, not to respond, but to understand. The way my body leaned toward him unconsciously when we sat side by side. One evening, sitting across from him in a quiet cafe, he paused mid-sentence. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "Yes." "Do you ever feel like you've been holding your breath for years without realizing it?" The question landed deeper than I expected. "Yes," I admitted. He nodded slowly. "I thought it was just me." That night, walking home alone, I placed a hand over my chest and felt my heartbeat steady but alive. Memory stirred, not of people, not of acts, but of sensation, wanting, anticipation. I didn't resist it, but I didn't surrender either. Not yet. I told myself caution was wisdom. That experience had taught me not to rush emotional terrain so easily destabilized at this stage of life. When you fall at 25, you recover quickly. When you fall later, you fall farther. Still, denying desire doesn't make it disappear. It makes it patient. The moment it crossed into danger arrived quietly. We were at his apartment, my first time there, after an evening that had stretched naturally from conversation into familiarity. Bookshelves, warm lighting, music playing softly, forgotten as background. We stood near the window, city lights flickering below like paused possibilities. There was no plan, no intention. He turned toward me, expression thoughtful rather than urgent. "This feels like a line," he said, "and I don't want to cross it without knowing you're there with me." My breath caught, not because he was close, but because he had articulated exactly what I was avoiding naming. I stepped closer. "I'm here," I said, and meant only that, only the moment, only the truth of now. He didn't touch me right away. When he did, it was gentle. His hand rested lightly against my arm, fingers warm, grounding. My body responded instantly, not explosively, but deeply. A quiet pull centered low in my abdomen, spreading warmth through me, awakening sensation I had archived for too long. I didn't move away. We stayed like that, breathing, neither of us rushing to define what came next. That night, I returned home alone, deliberately. And yet, when I closed my door behind me, my reflection stared back differently. My posture was softer, my eyes more alert. Desire had fully returned, and for the first time, I realized something that frightened me far more than wanting him. I didn't want it to be fleeting. Wanting him was easy. That was the part no one warns you about, how natural it feels when desire finally returns. There was no awkwardness, no sense of forcing myself into something unfamiliar. My body knew exactly what to do with the feeling. It welcomed it like an old guest who had been gone too long. What frightened me wasn't desire. It was what followed it. In the days after that night at his apartment, I noticed how my thoughts arranged themselves around him, without my permission. I replayed conversations in my mind while washing dishes. I wondered what expression might cross his face when he read something interesting, or how his voice would sound if I called unexpectedly. Not obsessively, not desperately, but consistently. And consistency is dangerous when you've spent years convincing yourself that attachment is optional. I tried to create distance. Not dramatically, nothing that would raise questions, just subtle shifts, leaving a coffee meeting a little earlier, letting a message sit unanswered longer than it needed to, choosing solitude when togetherness whispered too loudly. Daniel noticed. Of course he did. We were walking one afternoon, the air warm and heavy with late sunlight. Our conversation drifted easily until it narrowed, like water funneling into something more deliberate. "You've been pulling back," he said, not accusing, not confused, just observant. I stopped walking. "So have you," I replied. He considered that, then smiled softly. "Yes, but not because I want less." That was the moment I felt the fragile balance inside me tilt. "I don't know what I want," I admitted, "and that's not comfortable for me." He turned fully toward me then. "What is comfortable?" I opened my mouth and closed it again. Comfort, I realized, meant predictability. It meant quiet evenings without question. It meant control. But comfort had also dulled me. "I'm afraid," I said finally. "Of me?" "No," I shook my head slowly. "Of myself." That was the truth I had avoided naming. Desire didn't frighten me because of what it might lead to physically. It frightened me because it woke parts of me capable of risk, of hoping, of choosing, of wanting more than what was guaranteed. At our age, hope is not naive. It's brave. Daniel listened without interruption. He didn't minimize my fear. He didn't rush to reassure me with promises I didn't ask for. Instead, he said something that surprised me. "Then let's not decide anything yet." I looked at him. "That's it?" "That's everything," he replied. "We don't have to turn this into a future or a memory right now. We can just let it exist. Existence without expectation." That night, alone in my bed, I let my body respond fully for the first time. Not frantically, not urgently. Slowly. My thoughts didn't race toward fantasy. They lingered on sensation, the remembered warmth of his hand, the steadiness of his presence, the way he waited when he could have pushed. I felt desire move through me like a low tide returning, not overwhelming, but deep and persistent, and I allowed it. In the days that followed, intimacy grew in quieter ways. Conversations deepened, silences lengthened. Touch happened almost accidentally. A hand on my back to guide me through a crowded space, fingers brushing mine when we reached for the same cup. Once, sitting side by side on a bench overlooking the river, he leaned slightly closer. "I want to be clear about something," he said. "I'm not interested in rushing you into anything, but I also don't want to pretend I don't want you." My breath caught at the honesty in his voice. "I don't need pretending," I replied. "I just need time." "Then take it," he said. "I'm not going anywhere." That simple statement lodged itself deep inside me. Not a promise, a presence. The first time we kissed was almost anticlimactic, and yet unforgettable. It wasn't charged with desperation or novelty. It didn't echo with urgency. It arrived softly, as if it had been waiting patiently for permission. His lips touched mine briefly, hesitantly, then rested there. And in that moment, everything went quiet. No wondering where this would lead. No fear of aftermath. Just the warmth, the connection, the affirmation that my body still knew how to receive pleasure. And that pleasure didn't require apology. When we pulled apart, neither of us spoke right away. That felt right, I said softly. He nodded. Yes. After that, restraint became conscious rather than defensive. We chose moments carefully, valued slowness, allowed anticipation to build rather than chasing release. There is a particular kind of intimacy that lives only in waiting, and waiting taught me something unexpected. My desire wasn't youthful or reckless. It was grounded, intentional, deeply aware of consequence. I started noticing myself differently, standing a little straighter, choosing clothes because they pleased me, not because they blended in, meeting my own reflection without the old detachment. But with this awakening came a realization I couldn't ignore much longer. Wanting him meant opening myself to loss again. It meant vulnerability, not just emotional, but existential. When you've lived long enough, you know exactly what heartbreak costs. You know how deeply it rearranges a life. The question wasn't whether he could hurt me. The question was whether a closed heart was safer than an unfulfilled one. The answer didn't come all at once. It arrived gently. One evening, walking home alone, I felt the unusual ache of looking forward to something. Not an event, not a milestone, a person. And my chest tightened with both fear and gratitude. I understood then that I was already chosen, by myself. The real danger wasn't wanting him. The real danger was convincing myself I didn't deserve to want anything at all. The moment didn't arrive with drama. There were no raised voices, no ultimatums, no sudden declarations that forced a decision. It came quietly, the way real turning points often do. Daniel invited me to dinner one evening, cooking for the first time since we'd known each other. It should have felt ordinary, but it didn't. There was intention in the gesture, not pressure, an offering rather than a demand. I almost declined. That impulse startled me. Not because I didn't want to go, but because avoidance had become my last defense. As long as I kept everything measured, everything remained manageable. But I was tired of managing myself into numbness. So I said yes. His apartment was warmer than I remembered, lit softly by lamplight that erased any harsh edges. Music played quietly in the background, something slow and deliberate, like breathing. He moved through the kitchen with unhurried precision, neither nervous nor indifferent. Watching him, I felt the familiar tension settle into my body. Not sharp, not urgent, but steady. A hum beneath the surface. We ate slowly. Talk drifted naturally, not about the future, not about past wounds, but about moments, small stories, observations, laughter that came easily without effort. Afterward, we cleared the table together. That's when it shifted. We stood close near the sink, hands brushing as we passed plates back and forth. He paused, resting one palm briefly against the counter. I felt his presence behind me, not looming, not possessive, just there. "May I?" he asked softly. I didn't ask what he meant. I turned. His hand rested lightly against my waist, fingertips barely touching fabric. The contact grounded me instantly. Awareness bloomed, warm, slow, undeniable. I didn't freeze. I leaned into him. That was all the permission either of us needed. The kiss that followed wasn't tentative this time. It was still gentle, still unhurried, but it carried certainty. His lips moved against mine with deliberate patience, as if he was in no rush to reach anywhere beyond the moment itself. My body opened to the sensation naturally. Heat pooled low, spreading upward, awakening every nerve that had been dormant out of habit rather than time. I became acutely aware of my age, not as limitation, but as depth. Every sensation felt fuller, more deliberate, because I wasn't ignoring it anymore. His hands moved slowly, resting at my back, my waist, my arms, never grasping, never demanding. Each touch asked a question my body answered willingly. And still, when he pulled back slightly, I surprised myself. "Wait," I whispered. He stopped immediately. "Yes?" My heart pounded. Not from desire, but from the importance of the moment. "I need to know," I said, steadying my breath, "that this isn't an escape for either of us." He met my gaze, serious but calm. "It isn't." "How do you know?" "Because I'm not trying to forget anything," he said softly. "I'm choosing this." That distinction unraveled something inside me. Choosing, not grasping, not hiding, not distracting myself from loneliness. Choosing presence. I nodded once. That was my answer. What followed wasn't hurried. It wasn't defined by urgency or hunger alone. We moved together slowly, listening, responding, allowing, not performing youth, but honoring experience. I won't describe everything that happened between us. What matters is how it felt. I felt safe inside my own desire. I felt seen without being exposed. I felt wanted without being reduced to a role. Later, lying beside him in the quiet glow of the room, I rested my head against his chest and listened to his breathing. My body felt warm, alive, deeply at ease. But what moved me most wasn't physical satisfaction. It was the stillness that followed, the absence of regret. Instead of fear creeping in, something else settled, calm. For the first time in years, I wasn't bracing myself for disappointment. I wasn't calculating outcomes or rehearsing future conversations. I was simply there. And I understood something essential in that silence. I hadn't crossed a line. I had crossed back into myself. The morning after, I woke before the city did. Light filtered softly through the curtains, turning the room pale and forgiving. For a brief moment, I didn't remember where I was, only how my body felt. Calm, warm, unburdened. Daniel slept beside me, his breathing steady, unguarded. I watched him for a while without touching, without rushing to assign meaning to anything that had happened. There was no urge to flee, no instinct to retreat inward. That alone felt extraordinary. I dressed quietly and stepped into the kitchen, needing space to feel the moment settle on its own terms. Coffee brewed, familiar and grounding. I wrapped my hands around the mug and stood near the window, just as I did every morning at home. Only this time, I wasn't alone, and the difference didn't scare me. When Daniel joined me, he didn't speak right away. He simply stood beside me, close enough to be felt, not close enough to crowd. "Good morning," he said softly. "Good morning." There was no awkwardness, no unspoken tension trying to define what came next. That, I realized, was the true shift, not what we'd shared physically, but how naturally we occupied the same space afterward. We talked quietly, about nothing important, about nothing urgent. Then he said, "I don't need today to mean anything more than what it is." I turned to look at him. Neither do I. And yet, we both understood that something had changed, not dramatically, not permanently, but intentionally. In the days that followed, life didn't rearrange itself around us. There were no declarations, no promises made under the glow of new connection. We returned to our routines, work, errands, obligations. What changed was how I moved through it all. I noticed myself smiling in places where I used to simply exist. I listened more closely to my own reactions. I honored the quiet wants instead of dismissing them as inconvenient. Desire, I learned, doesn't demand constant expression. It asks for acknowledgement. Daniel and I continued to see each other, slowly, deliberately, sometimes intimately, sometimes simply present. We spoke openly about boundaries, about fears that came not from uncertainty, but from experience. There was respect in that honesty. One evening, weeks later, we walked along the river where the air carried the promise of cooling weather. The lights reflected off the water like softened memories. "I've been thinking," he said casually. "So have I," replied, smiling. He glanced at me. "That doesn't concern you?" "No," I said. "It means I'm alive." We stopped at the railing, watching the river move forward without hesitation, without regret. "I don't know where this leads," I admitted. He nodded. "Neither do I." And then, without drama, without pressure, he said something that stayed with me long after. "But I do know I don't want to rush toward the end of something, just because I'm afraid of wanting it." Those words echoed a familiar truth back to me, one I had tried to ignore for years. I had mistaken caution for wisdom and safety for fulfillment. As I grow older, I understand now that not every chapter needs to be sealed. Some deserve to remain open, not because they guarantee happiness, but because they allow possibility. I no longer believe that desire fades because of age. I believe we silence it to protect ourselves from disappointment. And while caution has its place, so does courage. This story doesn't end with certainty. It ends with choice, the choice to stay open, to feel fully, to let desire exist without demanding it justify itself. If there's anything I've learned, it's this. It's not too late to want deeply. It's only too late when we stop listening. If this story felt familiar, if it stirred something quiet inside you, share your thoughts in the comments. And if you'd like to hear what happens next, when I choose again, subscribe. Some chapters aren't meant to close.